My name is Alan Wiseman, and I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. And along with Craig Volden of the Batten School at the University of Virginia, I'm also the co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. And we're very excited today to welcome Senator Gary Peters from the great state of Michigan to sit down with us for a little bit of time and talk about his experiences working in Congress. As many of you know, Senator Peters actually started his career in Congress when he was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2008. And he served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2009 up until 2015, when he then moved over to the United States Senate. He was most recently reelected to another full term in the U.S. Senate this past November 2020. And us at the Center for Effective Lawmaking have been incredibly impressed in following Senator Peters' career, especially in this most recently completed Congress, where we identified him as the most highly effective lawmaker in the U.S. Senate. Now, that in and of itself is a really impressive accomplishment, but it's even more so if you realize the fact that Senator Peters, being a member of the Democratic Party, was actually in the minority party in this most recently completed Congress. And for all of our data dating back to 1973, we've never seen a case up until now when a member of the minority party was actually the most effective lawmaker in the Senate. So we were really excited to get a chance to sit down with him and talk about the way in which he approached lawmaking. So please welcome Gary Peters. We're so excited to have you, Senator. We really appreciate it.
Well, good to be with you, Alan. I appreciate both of you. Thanks for Craig. It's good to be with both, and I look forward to our conversation.
Great. Well, we're excited to do that. So what we're going to be doing right now is we have a few specific questions we'd like to ask you that would relate to your broader experiences, both within and outside of Congress. But that being said, we'd really love to hear from you with any specific examples you could bring to bear that would illustrate some of the points you have. And we'll just take it really from there, if you don't mind. And I think related to that point, just tying back to what I was first saying, when you first entered Congress, as I noted a little bit earlier, you were in the U.S. House. And Craig and I were both really interested to get your perspective on how your prior experiences, and more specifically, perhaps your experience as a state legislator in Michigan or alternatively serving on the city council, how these prior experiences might have influenced the way in which you approached or thought about lawmaking in the U.S. House and now the U.S. Senate.
Well, it does inform my approach, and you pull all those experiences together. And for me, it's about common sense problem solving. That's what has always attracted me to public service as an opportunity to solve some of the tough problems that we face as a country. And bringing the perspective that I had prior to that service in business, as you mentioned, in state and local government, as well as my military experience, pull all that together. So most of my career prior to public service, I spent 20 plus years in the investment business. I was assistant vice president and a vice president with two major financial services firms. So had a real understanding of the investment world, which is why when I first got elected to Congress, I sought out a seat on the Financial Services Committee. And at that time was particularly a big time because, as you know, 2008-9 was in the middle of the Great Recession and what was happening on Wall Street and the Dodd-Frank legislation that was a major rewrite of reforms. And I was on the Financial Services Committee, and actually, because of that experience that I had, that experience in the investment world, Nancy Pelosi actually asked me to serve on the conference committee as a freshman. And both of you are scholars, know that usually freshmen don't get on a conference committee, let alone a conference committee as big as Dodd-Frank was for the regulatory reform. So that was, I drew on that experience a great deal through that service. I also served in the military, was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserve, CB combat warfare designation, have done some studies at the War College. And so that military background has really helped me working on national security issues, particularly now in the Senate. As the chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, I also serve on the Armed Services Committee. So when I look at from a national security perspective, I kind of oversee both the home team and the away team when it comes to keeping us safe as a country. And that really has been invaluable background. And then you mentioned my work in city council and in the state legislature. That allowed me, I think, gave me certainly a leg up when it came to lawmaking in the Congress, having done that. In fact, you mentioned my record here this last term. When I served in the state Senate for the 8 years, I actually had more bills signed into law than any Democratic senator during those 8 years. And I served in the minority during those 8 years too. So I was very skilled in dealing with the minority position, which I'm in right now, so to speak. I've spent a lot of years in the minority, now in the majority. And if you ask me which is better, I will tell you the majority is a whole lot better than the minority to serve in. So I appreciate that. But it was that kind of background in working in the state legislature that really kind of taught me the nuts and bolts. Now, Congress is a little different, but the basics are pretty much there. And I think that perspective is so important, particularly now as we're dealing with the pandemic and the fact that this is an issue that requires a whole of government approach to deal with it. We have to work with local government. We have to work with state government, federal. Everybody has to come together. And understanding when the federal government acts, how does that actually translate into how a state is going to be able to provide services and use that federal money, and particularly when it comes to local government and city council. That's really where the buck stops. I've served at all three levels, but when you're a local city council person or a mayor, it truly stops at your doorstep. When you go to the grocery store every night or any night, folks are pulling you aside in a very personal way. And knowing how what we do in Washington impacts local government has been invaluable to me, and allows me to I think, kind of get a better appreciation of what the policies that we're engaged in Washington, what that's really going to mean to our local communities.
Well, let me add my note of thanks and welcome for you joining us here today. I'm interested, you were talking about kind of the building on your minority experience in the state legislature and when you get up to Congress. And I'm also interested in your experience in moving from the House to the Senate. How do you see the differences between House and Senate? And then were you fortunate enough to be able to bring some of your staff with you, House to Senate? How do you see staff continuity and experience in playing a role in legislating?
Yeah, I'll start with that because I think that's just of vital importance. And I was certainly blessed to be able to bring my House staff with me to the Senate. I kept my chief of staff. Some folks make those changes. I didn't. I wanted a team that I knew and who knew me, and we had worked together. And so I brought that staff over to hit the ground running. We had to expand that staff because the difference to your question, which is clear, especially in a state like Michigan, the difference between the geographic reach and the population is pretty dramatic. There are 14 members of the House, and so I basically have 14 times the geographic area to cover and population. Our staffs don't increase by that much, as you know, as well. Right. So they're bigger, but that's still from a workload management perspective is a real challenge going into the Senate because you've got a whole lot to cover. Just like incoming emails from constituent correspondence goes up dramatically. If you don't have systems in place to handle that, you're not going to respond as quickly as folks back home want you to, and certainly deserve to have that kind of response. And so that is important, and the continuity was important for me as well. In terms of some of the other differences in coming over, and particularly in terms of what both of you are focused on, which is lawmaking, that was certainly different for me. And the fact that when you're in the House, you're on one, perhaps two committees. When I was on financial services, that's an exclusive committee. So if you're going to be on another one, you had to get a waiver, which I did. But you're really focused on one committee, and you can really drill down deep into the work in that particular committee. In the Senate, we're on more committees, and there's 100 of us to do what 435 do. The workload's the same, but we're spread out across more committees. So the breadth of what we had to deal with increases quite a bit. So there's a little bit of drinking from a fire hose when you first come in in dealing with that. The other thing that I thought was interesting from a lawmaking perspective is that in the House, there was a sense like if you're going to introduce legislation, you're probably going to if one that you expect to move, not just messaging, so folks will introduce messaging bills, but if one you're supposed to move, it's usually within your committee because you're going to have the most control over seeing it get through the committee. And so I came into the Senate and I have a lot of ideas, a lot of things that I wanted to do. And I'm going like, well, that's not really in my committee. I still remember a colleague of mine coming up to me like, Gary, it doesn't matter it's in your committee. You're a senator. You can introduce anything you want. This is the way it works here. And so it does allow you to deal with a broader breadth of issues than you would normally in the House for that purposes. So those are a couple of certainly major differences.
Well, that's really helpful, and I'm curious to know from your perspective, especially given that you came from the House, taking a step back, given you came from a state legislature, then the House, and now in the Senate. I want to return to the point that I raised during introductions, and that being that thinking about the scope of your lawmaking effectiveness in the most recently completed Senate, the scope of your success for a minority party member is really unprecedented in our data. And from Craig and my perspective, we'd really love to hear from you, bluntly speaking, Senator, how you did this. I mean, how did you really approach lawmaking as an enterprise in this most recently completed Congress that contributed to such a high degree of success in moving your agenda?
Well, I think you need a lot of help to do that. I think it's probably the first off and actually to Craig's point about staff. Staff is really critically important, that you have a real good team that you put together to do that. So you've got to have that, and we can talk more about that. But it's also all about building coalitions. That's the way you're able to move things, especially in the minority. I mean, I'm always going to need to have a Republican co-sponsor. I worked very hard to make sure that I had support with the majority party, trying to find common ground. And I think that's something we've got to do, obviously, in a much broader way throughout Congress. That if we're going to get things done for the American people, which we must, I'm a big believer that we've got to do this in a bipartisan way. I'm ranked as one of the most bipartisan senators from the folks at the Lugar Center, for example, and others, because it's part of how you get things done. And then you build those relationships. I say, from a member perspective, building the relationships with folks in the other party is absolutely critical. And that means not just asking folks to get on your bills, but that means getting on their bills as well, and showing that you can work together and find the kind of common ground necessary. And so I have a lot of member conversations. I believe that's incredibly important for the process to work. And then when it comes to staff, the staff does a lot of the heavy lifting, clearly, on the day-to-day work. It's absolutely critical to have really good quality staff, people who share passion for public service, something that I have. And I tell members or folks who come into my staff kind of my view of how blessed we are to be able to serve the people of this great country in the Capitol. And I tell them the story when I walk out at night and I see the Capitol dome all lit up. It still puts a little tingle in my spine. I'm thinking, this is really amazing. And when that stops happening, that's when I know I need to leave because this is really an opportunity for us to make a difference. And I expect everybody on my staff to have that feeling as well, and that passion, and understand that we can make a difference, and seek out folks that have intellectual curiosity to say, these are problems. And when you discover problems, I ask my staff, don't just come to me with a problem, give me an idea. How do we solve it? What are pathways that we can use to get through that? And then in terms of relationships, it's critically important that my staff develop relationships with staff in other offices as well. Just as I'm doing it by member to member, they need to have those kinds of personal connections with folks so that there's some mutual trust in order to get things done. Because ultimately, if you don't have that, you're not going to be successful.
Yeah, that idea of building up connections and across party lines, and that you were doing so kind of across the board, I think is just so crucial. You mentioned bipartisanship and the Lugar ratings, and certainly those are correlated with our effectiveness scores as well. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Now, when you think about the specific pieces of legislation, you need not only co-sponsors from across the aisle, but enough votes to get it done, and probably signing off from in your case, last Congress, signing off from the committee chairs who are of the other party, signing off from the Republican Party leadership. How do you approach them? Here's an idea, I'm putting it forward, but really, what do you do next?
Well, and it is related to having relationships with those chairs too, which is critically important. And I found common ground with folks. And if you think of some of the folks that I've done a lot of legislation with, some of it has passed, some of it we're working on, that I work with. I mean, folks like Senator Cornyn, I've done a lot of work with him from Texas. And of course, he was the majority whip, so in a key leadership position. But I've helped him on legislation, and when I've asked him to help me, then he's certainly open to having that conversation. Right now, I'm still working very closely, for example, with Senator Thune on legislation for autonomous vehicles. We haven't passed this yet. This is critically important for the auto industry, and the auto industry, of course, is very important for me as a senator from Michigan. And it represents the future of mobility. We have to have a regulatory framework to deal with this advanced technology. But I built a very close relationship with Senator Thune working on that legislation, something that we share. And he's now the minority whip in a senior leadership position. I'm on Homeland Security Committee. I'm chair now. Before that, ranking member. I developed a good working relationship with Senator Johnson, for example. So it is critically important to have leadership and to have those relationships. And it's important because a lot of these bills we can pass with unanimous consent. It's difficult to get floor time in the Senate. That's why you'll see a fewer standalone bills pass through the Senate than you see in the House. It's just been more of the bills, and a lot of the legislation that I've written is actually in major pieces of legislation like the National Defense Authorization or FAA reauthorization or NASA, whatever it may be, and things that I'm very proud of the work that my office did, but they're in those bills. But so because you need to have that kind of broad support, it does take a lot of reaching out to folks. So people will put holds on our bills. It's not unusual. I'll have a bill I'll try to move and I'll have a senator put a hold on it. But that's where I either pick up the phone, but more importantly, instead of picking up the phone, I grab them on the floor and buttonhole them on the floor and have a face-to-face conversation and try to find out what is it that their concerns were. How do we kind of deal with that? Sometimes we have to make some alterations to the bill, whatever it may be, the give and take in the negotiation to get it done. But to move it, it is a pretty hands-on process. If you're not hands-on, you're not going to be successful.
How did you find to be most successful in navigating holds in particular?
You go directly to the member. So you go directly to the member. Sometimes, first I should back off. First off, I try to have the staff work it out. So when we have a hold, staff will contact staff. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, then I will go. Although if I want to accelerate it, I'll go right to the member, and I will usually do that quite a bit. I think sometimes the other staff of the member don't like the fact that I'm going directly to the member, but that's the way to get things moving quicker in order to make that happen. So that's usually the way to work through that. And sometimes the relationships too. If I can't, for whatever reason, I may have a member who it's tough to move. It's the relationships that I'll have with other Republican senators, and I'll ask them to go to their colleague as well. And so I try to double. That's why having a good co-sponsor is important. So I can double team or triple team or whatever it takes to move somebody along.
Perfect.
I mean, these points you're raising about the importance of relationships and the need to work to facilitate trust among each other is really insightful and interesting to Craig and I want to think a little bit more about the substantive policy agenda that you advanced in previous Congresses, because one of the other points that really emerged in analyzing your legislative agenda was that not only were you so successful in advancing a large collection of your bills, but if we really broke them down issue by issue, we actually found you were the highest performing or most successful Democratic senator in several different issue areas, not many of which were entirely closely related to each other, such as agriculture, government operations, science and technology. And in thinking about the scope of your legislative agenda, not just the number of bills you introduced, but really all the different areas you're focusing on, one question that emerged in our analysis, which I want to present to you, is, to what degree do you see benefits or maybe trade-offs that you have to make in considering moving forward a really expansive issue agenda that covers a lot of different areas versus being a little bit more tightly focused, especially as it relates to your constituency in Michigan, for example?
Yeah, and I think to answer that is that when you look at the range of issues we're involved in, it represents the range of issues that I have to deal with every day with the folks in Michigan. And so, and a lot of the ideas that we get of things that we need to do, I mentioned clearly the staff engagement and how we're involved. But when I say staff, it's not just my legislative staff, as important as they are, as they're working, but some of the best ideas come from my constituent service folks or from my regional folks that are going around the state and talking to people. And as you do that, you're getting a whole range of issue areas and problem sets that people are coming forward with. One is, as an example, legislation that we passed this last term dealt with expansion of apprenticeship programs for for veterans to use their GI Bill benefits for skilled training programs. You know, a lot of folks are familiar with the GI Bill to help folks in college or the 4-year degree or 2-year degree, but you could use your GI benefits if you're in an apprenticeship program to help pay for rent and for food. If you're coming out of the military, particularly if you're a little more senior, and you go into an apprenticeship program, that can be tough economically, and especially if you have a family to do that. So it helps them go into skilled trades. But what I learned actually from feedback and folks in the district is that even though Michigan has roughly 1,000 Department of Labor registered apprenticeship programs, less than 100 actually qualified for GI benefits. That makes no sense. A veteran should have the full range of opportunities provided to them. That came from a constituent through the staff. Then we figured out how do we fix it and pulled a coalition together, a broad coalition of all the veterans groups, not just by, in a bipartisan way, but getting outside groups to come together to make that happen. So, but that was a bill that didn't go to my committees. It went to the Health, Education, and Labor Committee. So it went to a different committee. So, and as I mentioned in the House, that's always a little more difficult if it's in a different committee than you're in. But in the Senate, I found it to be a whole lot different than in the House. So it's a different committee, but I could talk to the chair, I could talk to the ranking member, build support to do that. And then others would come across, as you mentioned, agriculture. We expanded agricultural inspectors, for example, critically important to protect the industry, and had all the agricultural folks. And in order to get that support, it meant I had to reach out to the chair, Republican chair of the Ag Committee, and Senator who's now retired, Senator Roberts, but he really liked it and helped me move it. And then I built a relationship with him to work on other bills to get him on unrelated bills as well. So it is kind of it's a coalition snowball that continues to build. And so to your question about benefits, part of the benefits of working across different areas, it also allows me to develop relationships and have a track record of getting things done with a larger group of members than I would normally if I just specialized in a very narrow area.
So Alan was asking you kind of about the breadth, and I want to talk about kind of the depth of, how many bills, right? So you don't become the most effective lawmaker in the Senate by having, just 1 or 2. You had 14 of those that you sponsored yourself, in addition to the ones where your ideas were incorporated, but 14 of those passing the Senate and 10 of those becoming law. That means at some points in time, you must have had pretty exhausted staff or how do we think about, that level of number of balls in the air? And is that unusually difficult at that level? Or how do you manage that kind of sizable of an agenda?
Well, I can tell you, I do have tired staff. They do an outstanding job, so I will give them full credit. They are an amazing group of people who are very, very dedicated, and they work really hard because it is a lot of calls, it's a lot of working. And I figure as we're trying to move bills, and we're calling other staffs, they're trying to move their own bills. They've got other issues they're prepping for committee hearings. And you asked about difference in the House and the Senate. We also have all the confirmation hearings. We've got other things that we're doing as well that you don't have in the House. So we've got a lot of moving pieces, but it definitely takes a lot of staff work to make that happen, to move. But I probably want to add something else about what's important. And you mentioned the relationships, and I've been talking primarily about the Senate. Well, what I have found to be extremely helpful to be able to move that too is the relationships that I developed when I was in the House. So I served there for 6 years, had an opportunity to get to know folks there. And that's invaluable. You're only halfway there if you get it out of the Senate, and then you have to get to the House. Now, the last 2 years, we had a Democratic House, so that was an advantage, obviously, being in the majority. But the House has got a lot on their plate. They were passing lots of bills, and so you needed to have those kinds of relationships. And I took a very hands-on approach with that too. I would walk over to the House and sit down with members and talk about bills that I had and how we could work together to be able to do that. So it is time intensive, but it's worthwhile to get things done.
Was that conversations mostly with Michigan members, with people you had known before, with leadership? How did those House relationships go?
No, it's broader than that. Certainly, it's really important to have your Michigan delegation. So I know obviously my Republican colleagues from Michigan, and they've been very helpful to me. But it's broader than that. It's other folks that I just knew as a member of the House and people that I became friendly with while I was there. The other thing that I'll say too, in terms of relationships, which has been helpful to me, is that when I was elected to the House or to the Senate in 2014, I was the only new Democrat elected that year. If you recall, 2014 was a wave year. I was in a class of there were 13 new U.S. senators elected, 12 Republicans and me. So I was a class of one. So I like to say I was class president immediately as a result of that. But I also, the one thing that also was helpful is that when you come in, it's kind of like going to college. You know, your freshman class comes in and you have a little bit of camaraderie. I was able to build that camaraderie with a number of my fellow freshmen senators as well. And they were spread out across all those committees as well, which allows me to have breadth of the types of things that I could work on and build from that kind of contact.
I mean, this is fascinating and related to both our own findings and some of the points you said a little bit earlier. From the outside, if we hadn't even had this conversation, but just looked at the bills you introduced and the way in which they advanced, one of the points that really stands out to us is the fact that it seemed as if you were consciously seeking Republican co-sponsors for essentially all of your legislation. And listening to your thoughts right now, I'm inferring this was actually a conscious decision and strategy on your part. So related to that point, one question that we might have is, to what degree would you recommend that other senators, or really other House members, but just focusing on the Senate, other senators should engage in a similar strategy, or why do you think some senators might not do that so actively?
Yeah, there are a lot of folks, unfortunately, that are very partisan in both of the Senate and House. So some folks who feel that way, I think, have a harder way to do it. That's not in my DNA. That I figure we have to come together to solve problems, and those are kind of the districts that I've represented. It kind of depends on where you come from too, and what is your district composed of? So just to give you a little bit of kind of my history getting there. When I got elected, you mentioned, Alan, I was elected in 2008, and I was elected in a district where I was the first Democrat, I think since it was 1893 was the last Democrat that was elected to the district. So I was the first there for a long time, or since a long time. And then in 2010, the Republicans came at me with everything they had. And if you recall, 2010 was not a really good year for Democrats. It was a Republican wave. And in fact, in my district, the Republican governor won the district by 26 points, but I still got reelected in that district. And the way you get elected in a district like that, one is you're very visible, you're doing constituent services, you're making a difference, but it also shows you're looking to find common ground to get things done. So having a record of getting things done in a meaningful way is critically important, and that means reaching across the aisle. If I were to take this conversation a little broader than just the lawmaking, kind of where we are as a country, the thing that I'm most concerned about is just this hyper polarization that we have, hyper partisanship that we have. And it's not just reflected in Congress, as both of you know, it's reflected throughout our society, which is problematic. But I'm just struck. I was asked by my colleagues, I think it was 3 years ago, to read George Washington's farewell address before the Senate. Every year a senator is asked to do that. And I'm sure both of you have read this. You know this inside and out, but I hadn't read it in a while, and I read it. And as I was reading it, I was just struck by, George Washington's words of the factions or the parties, and the fact that you would just be in these deeply entrenched factions, and that folks wouldn't talk to each other. And when that happens, you're going to see the rise of a demagogue that will appeal to people's fears and to their passions, and the young republic will disappear when that happens. And I just am real fearful that we are in very dangerous turf when it comes to this. And it's incumbent on us as members to be working together, finding that common ground. There's some clear differences. I'm a proud Democrat and have very strong democratic values, but there's a lot that we have in common as well. And if I can build some of those relationships, I'm hoping we can build those relationships to deal with the really big issues. We still got a ways to go in that regard, but that's the way I approach this job. And I think that's why I've been able to win these tough races. And in fact, I even got redistricted after I won that race. And in 10, Michigan went through redistricting, and we lost a congressional seat. And the Republicans controlled the governor, the Senate, and the House. And so they drew me out of the district. Basically, I have 3 congressional districts within a few hundred yards of my house. It depends on what window I look out of. I'm in a different district. And so my wife and I joked we're going to get a plaque for the house saying the redistricting plan for this decade started at this address, to do it. So I ran in a district that I represent a part of, but it went into the city of Detroit. It was a majority African American district, and I had to run against an African American colleague of mine. But I won that seat and was able to stay in Congress. And the way I did it is the fact that people, bottom line, just want to see someone who is getting things done, rolling up their sleeves and focusing on the job.
When you were particularly successful building those relationships with Republicans, as we were noting, you were in the minority party, now in the majority party. Same approach to lawmaking, nevertheless. Why would it change? Or we've seen it change for some people.
Yeah, it would. It's not changing at all for me. I'm working. We've introduced legislation so far. We're doing the same way to work together. I've got a close working relationship. As chair, I'm now chair of Homeland Security Committee, and the ranking member is Rob Portman from Ohio. We work very closely together. He's another example of someone who I did a lot of work with, bills that we've introduced, a couple that were signed into law, and others that we will continue to work on. But we're going to do that in a bipartisan way and try to do it at least in a nonpartisan way as much as possible. It's when you think about the issues that I have in Homeland Security, it's Homeland Security and Government Affairs. So I oversee the Department of Homeland Security, and we're the top oversight committee through the Government Affairs for the Senate, plus a number of agencies like the Postal Service, which of course is the center of a lot of attention right now. But as I think about what I have to deal with as chair of Homeland Security, and I just had this experience a couple of weeks ago. I'm sitting on the couch with my wife on Sunday. I'm looking at the New York Times. And I said, well, here are the 4 top stories in the New York Times. First one was the southern border, what was happening there, and El Paso. And I was down there with Rob Portman, actually. The second one was the rise of violent extremist groups and how we're going to deal with that threat. The third was the SolarWinds cyber attack and cybersecurity and how that has to be addressed in a significant way. And the fourth one was FEMA and the distribution of vaccines. I go, the top 4 stories are all in my committee right now as chair. And the only way we're going to get through these things, because they're all tough problems, is we got to do this in a bipartisan way. And so to your question, my view has not changed. We've got to come together, because that's how you have lasting solutions. I don't want to have just this constant seesaw back and forth, whoever's in power. We got to have a little more continuity than that. In my mind, that's how you govern. And so trying to get that up front makes more lasting solutions to tough problems.
And then in terms of that chair position, a lot on your plate. And I could imagine that for some chairs, they would feel pressure to act on those issues and might take them away from their home state issues. Do you feel there's any of that pressure in your case, or how do you navigate that?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, it's an important committee for the state. I mean, when you think about border issues, Michigan is a border state. I remind my colleagues every opportunity I get, we have a northern border in this country, not just the southern border, that we have to make sure is secure. And when it comes to trade with the border issues that I deal with, of the 5 busiest border crossings in terms of the volume of trade, the land border crossings, the 5 busiest in North America, 2 of them are in Michigan. So we got Detroit, Windsor, and Port Huron, Sarnia. So the work I do, Homeland Security, is vitally important in that area. But certainly when it comes to just Homeland Security issues, the distribution of vaccines, the work of FEMA right now, if I oversee FEMA, that impacts my state in a very significant way. And right now, unfortunately, we're seeing a real spike in cases here in Michigan right now. So we're trying to make sure we have resources there, or whether it's cybersecurity or the other. So while I tackle these big issues for the country, we're certainly impacted the same as everybody else. And so I don't see any disconnect there whatsoever.
I wanted to build on a couple of comments that you raised regarding the scope of bipartisanship that both you engage in regularly, as well as the need for it in all of lawmaking in many different perspectives. And I obviously don't really want to spend much time talking about the filibuster debate that's obviously going on either implicitly or explicitly. But I would be curious, given how successful you were being in the minority party, as you said, even going back to your state house days, and advancing your legislative agenda, and you have such a consistent pattern of engaging in bipartisan lawmaking, Do you think in the contemporary Congress, supermajoritarian institutions like the filibuster, do they contribute to bipartisanship or do they inhibit it?
Well, I think to answer that question, I would say that a filibuster could possibly work, and you've seen instances in the past of it working, if, and this is a big if the minority party acts in good faith. You assume that they're working in good faith, and they're going to come to the table to negotiate. So when I do the bills that we're talking about here, I'm dealing with my colleagues who are working in good faith. They're trying to figure out, okay, Gary, I understand your problem. I get it. I have that problem too, or I like to be part of that solution. Let's work together on it. And they're coming to me in good faith. But if they just want to obstruct, then there isn't going to be any tool that's really going to help bring people together if that's their intent. So I'm certainly hopeful that with the broader debate, I would hope that my Republican colleagues would act in good faith, and we'll try to find common ground and try to get, as I mentioned earlier, if you can get bipartisan solutions, they're going to be more lasting. I think those are better solutions. But I would hope that folks would realize that this should not be just about blocking important pieces of legislation to have some political one-upmanship and perhaps give a black eye to the president or whoever it may be. But if you come in good faith, but if you don't come in good faith, I think ultimately what the people of this country deserve is action on the problems that we face. So they expect things to get done. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if we don't get anything done, then people start losing faith in their democratic institutions as well. And I mentioned earlier, I think we're in a precarious situation with hyperpartisanship and the polarization that we're having. And that can lead to a weakening of the democratic institutions that are so critical to maintaining this republic. And part of maintaining confidence in your government is seeing action that's impacting their lives in a meaningful way. And we can't lose sight of that.
One thing we're commenting on there is sort of what are the processes and procedures. You had mentioned serving on the conference committee for Dodd-Frank. How did you find that experience, resolving House-Senate differences? We don't see conference committees as much as we used to.
No, they don't, and especially that one. In fact, I think when I got on that committee, people said, Gary, one, you're a freshman. That's unusual that you're on this conference committee. But I don't know how long you'll stay in Congress, but you'll probably never be on a conference committee like this again. It's pretty unusual to have that happen. That was also a very workload heavy. I had lots of homework every single night, the massive amount of issues that we went through. But I found the debates very interesting. I mean, we actually got into some of the real lawmaking in a more open forum with those until late at night, going into the wee hours of the morning on number of mornings. I worked specifically on some legislation to make sure, or worked on it to make sure that some of the protections put in place to stop the widespread, really disastrous speculation we saw in the derivative market, which really fueled the downward spiral. That sometimes when you're dealing with that, we knew the pendulum went too far this way for Wall Street, but we didn't want to be in a situation where it go too far the other way. You want to try to find some of that median. And I was engaged in that issue with when you came to hedging, using derivatives to actually hedge, not speculators that would take a bet on a bet and then a bet on the bet kind of thing, which led to a house of cards. But in my case, Ford Motor Company, if you're hedging raw materials or hedging interest rates for your finance, in this case, their finance company, which that's how people buy cars. They'll finance it through Ford Motor Credit or GM Credit, and they need to have lower rates to be able to hedge that. They were being swept into some of these regulations that would have actually increased the cost dramatically. It wouldn't have dealt with the speculation and the risk, but it would have had a significant impact to the consumers. But it took a lot of persuasion, and we actually got engaged in a pretty active debate, like at 2:00 in the morning, with the whole committee, and I was able to successfully get that put in to make sure that we were finding common sense regulations that still protected consumers, but still allowed business to be able to hedge legitimate risks that they needed to hedge. That's a long example, but that's what happened in a conference committee in a more open forum than I've seen occur in normal committees, where a lot of that is done. It was done, behind the scenes.
Right.
In negotiations, and when you come to the committee, a lot of it has already been pretty much decided. And the debate that occurs everybody kind of knows where everybody's voting already. In that case, there were a number of instances where we didn't know. We would see the votes that take place, and everybody was counting votes as they were occurring, which was a pretty fascinating process to be a part of.
Yep.
No, I believe it. Craig can tell you we were fortunate enough to have former Congressman Barney Frank as well as Bob Kaiser come to Vanderbilt a couple of years ago to talk about their experience and or Congressman Frank's experience in terms of moving Dodd-Frank forward and Mr. Kaiser's experience documenting it. And the way he described the situation, similar to your experience, demonstrates is very unique in a variety of contexts, which is really fascinating to hear. I want to turn back to something you said a little bit earlier regarding, essentially what your constituents or American voters in general expect, or at least hopefully expect from their lawmakers. And I'm curious, to what degree or how much do you believe or think your constituents either care about your own level of lawmaking effectiveness, or to what degree they're really aware of it? And you intimated this, but I'm curious to know, to what degree do you think your level of lawmaking effectiveness, both in this most recent Congress and across your career, might have been influenced or related to this most recent election?
Well, I think it does matter. Now, obviously, partisanship factors a lot in elections, and I think the academic literature is fairly clear about how that's becoming more and more important, especially in Senate races. And we've seen that in recent Senate elections, where you're closely tied to the presidential race. But I still believe it makes a difference especially with independent voters who will want someone who looks as if, and as demonstrated, not just looks, but actually is demonstrated, that they're willing to try to find common ground. I think that's how I won some of the races I mentioned when in that House race, when the Republican governor is winning by 26 points,
Sure.
and I'm getting reelected as a Democrat. That's showing, a quarter of the electorate were voting for a Republican governor and then a Democratic member of Congress. And that was a big part of that, that folks saw me. And the work that I did related to the financial rescue and the work that I did in that case, which I was extremely active to making sure the auto industry received the help that they needed to get through the financial crisis. As you can imagine, would have been catastrophic for Michigan had General Motors and Chrysler gone down, and had they gone down, Ford would have gone as well. Sure. And the laws. So the fact that I was so intimately involved in that and helped make that happen, and had folks at that company say that. And then in my most recent election here, talking about the legislation, and it's not just the number of bills you're passing or the work, it's what does it mean to their lives, to explain, right, how that made a difference, and what drives you. It informs some of your values, or really your values. And one, for example, this was not a standalone bill. It was in a larger package, NDA, but one that I talked about a lot in the campaign. I know made a difference. Dealt work that I did for veterans who are suffering from PTSD. And this came again from a constituent. There was a gentleman in Grand Rapids who was served with honor and distinction as a Marine in Afghanistan. But when he came home, things weren't so great. He had substance abuse, nightmares, panic attacks, all the symptoms of PTSD, but it wasn't diagnosed. And he was basically kicked out of the Marines with a bad paper discharge. He ended up homeless on the streets of Grand Rapids. He went to the VA. They diagnosed him. They said, "You're suffering from PTSD as a result of your service, but we can't help you because you have a bad paper discharge. We can't do anything to help you." Well, that's outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. So I went to work. We got all the veterans groups together, built a bipartisan coalition, and now he and others in that position can go back to a board, if they have credible medical evidence, can have that discharge changed, and they can get the help that they need. So it's those kinds of actions that really matter for folks, and are important in campaigns, that people see what you're doing. And the other big issue for me this campaign too is the work that I've done to protect the Great Lakes. In Michigan, the Great Lakes are in our DNA. And that cuts across party lines. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican or independent. We all love the Great Lakes. And if you see a member of the U.S. Senate fighting and delivering to protect the Great Lakes, that's very helpful at election time. I still want to believe, and I still do believe, that good policy is good politics, and I live by that.
To get into the procedural weeds a little bit there, you have a good idea. It's going to matter for people. You were saying there might be multiple pathways. One is you could write that up yourself. The other is you could write it up yourself and then hope to incorporate it in a piece of legislation that's moving. Alternatively, you might just go to the leadership with an idea. How do you step through what you write up on your own, what you write up, but then try to reinsert in some other legislation? Just kind of, can you step us through that thinking a little bit?
Yeah, it's usually we just write it up regardless. So we've got an idea. We've got to first you start with the problem, and then a solution. We don't like solutions in search of a problem. You know, we have a problem and then the solution for it. And so we'll write that up and then figure out which is the best way to move it. So we'll introduce it. Often we'll introduce it as a bill. But I just want to get things passed too, and so you'll want to somewhat take the path of least resistance. If you can get it into a bigger package, that can be the path of least resistance because it's a whole package that's moving forward. But sometimes they just don't fit, and then you do the standalone legislation to move it forward. But it's important. I mean, for example, one recently it happened to be in the CARES Act for the pandemic relief. I worked on legislation related to my work with FEMA that allows folks to get unemployment insurance if the natural disaster hits, that you would get unemployment insurance even if you're not traditionally in the unemployment system. So if you're a small business owner, if you're part of the gig economy, you're a freelancer, but if your business has gone away, you're in trouble. You need to have income to keep food on the table. We do have some programs to help if a hurricane hits, for example, to help people. So I wrote the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Act that would allow that to occur for those folks, which is a big number. And that bill was actually incorporated into the CARES Act, and that's where it should have gone. There was no reason to do that independently.
Yeah.
We've got a big package that's coming out to help folks. Let's put in the authorizing language that was then appropriated through the CARES Act to be able to take care of it.
And
that
so then
one,
that was talking. Oh, sorry. That was talking to the committee chair and the party leaders, or how did that conversation?
Yeah, and that one certainly was the key person with that was Ron Wyden, who was the ranking member. He's the ranking member of finance, not the chair, but he was working on ideas similar to that, and he was certainly the main person when it came to negotiating it in the package. And so that was when I worked with Ron. But clearly, I'll be perfectly honest, it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Ron really leaning in. You got to have an ally who believes in it and pushes it hard, and he was an amazing champion.
Thanks.
You're giving us a lot of really constructive perspectives, both based on your own career and just observations that you've made across your time in Congress. And trying to sum up some of these thoughts, I'd be curious to know, there's lots of people, including many people who are going to be doing this interview, that might either be involved in politics or have political aspirations. And I'd be curious, just based on your own experience, what advice would you offer to a newly elected member of the House or the Senate, especially those who, similar to yourself, actively want to engage in lawmaking and want to be a successful lawmaker?
Well, I'll go back to staff. I'd say first, if you're coming in new, hire the best staff you can possibly hire. It's going to be really important to have folks that have that kind of background. I'm thinking of the chief of staff who I hired as a new member of the House, and he lived in the district. He'd been active and had been kind of following my career, but he also he worked for a stint with Nancy Pelosi in her office, and then he worked with Rahm Emanuel for a while, and then I got him. But that was pretty good pedigree as someone who knew his way around Washington, and that was incredibly important. And I could go through all my staff members who had great experience, if not in politics. They had good substantive understanding and were very, very smart people. And the thing I always look for are folks with that are really intellectually curious, that really want to kind of explore a number of avenues. Back to the point about a variety of issue areas. I want folks who are constantly thinking that way, but that's really critically important. And then go about developing relationships right away too with folks. So relationships with the people in your class, as I mentioned with my class in the Senate, but it's the same in the House. Get to know your folks that you've come in with right away. Those are going to be pretty important relationships for however long you stay in Congress. And don't, whatever you do, don't just get to know folks in your own party. Really step outside of your comfort zone. And that's in two ways. We all come with some policy expertise for whatever our background was prior to coming to Congress. But And you'll probably build on that. And in the House, you'll probably hopefully get on a committee that's related to that. People will try to do that. But I'd say step out of your comfort zone on that as well. As you step out of your comfort zone, you build relationships, you learn more about the broad reach of the federal government. And when you learn about that, and as you're out in your district or in your home state, talking to folks and they're coming to you with issues and problems, it just gives you a better perspective to kind of put the pieces all together and be the most effective representative of your state or your district that you can be.
Now, we've been naturally talking about lawmaking since we're the Center for Effective Lawmaking, but the committee you're chairing takes on a big oversight role as well. Do you see lawmaking and oversight, are they going hand in hand? Are they sometimes very different beasts? How do you think about those activities?
Yeah, I say they're intertwined. They definitely are, because as you do oversight, you'll find issues or areas that you need to address, and sometimes that's legislatively. Sometimes you do that through the administration, but you'll discover oversight and will discover problems that need to be addressed. So, example in my committee, one thing that we're going to be doing a lot of oversight, but we're going to be really doing a deep dive into the pandemic. And look at what happened and FEMA's role and the other agencies that were engaged as an oversight committee. And we'll do this. And this goes back, I'm going to do this as nonpartisan. This is not about a political gotcha. Let's point fingers at folks. I'll celebrate what worked, and we'll question and try to figure out how to fix things that didn't work. And that'll inevitably will probably mean some legislation or some sorts of actions to go with it. Same with cyber. We're going to do a very deep dive into cyber, and there's a lot of things. I've worked on legislation for cyber. We've got some that we just got out of committee just recently, in fact, bipartisan, working with the ranking member. It'll lead to legislation as to how do we strengthen our cyber defenses. So I see those as really complementary for the most part, depending on the issue, but generally important, because the whole idea is not just to do the oversight, but also make sure that whatever went wrong never happens again.
Right. Right.
I just want to follow up really quickly, or briefly at least, on a point you just raised about the importance of stepping out of one's comfort zone, especially with regards to policy interest and expertise. And I found that really insightful, and it made me wonder, to what degree, or essentially, what do you see as the role of external interest groups in the lawmaking process in terms of providing members of the House and Senate with their own policy expertise for precisely these purposes? And do you think their influences change over time, or do you think their influence changes depending on which chamber you've been in, House versus the Senate? Any thoughts you have would be really instructive.
Yeah, outside groups coming in, judge generally with their advocacy. No, I think they play an incredibly important role, because they will be experts in the area that they are involved in. They will give you good perspective. But I just have a cautionary note, depending on who they are, and if it's an industry, for example, to understand that perhaps the other side doesn't have an organized interest representing them. And so I always want to get both sides of the story. And so I think they can provide very valuable information, but I don't take it at face value. We always want to verify and check out exactly does that seem reasonable what they're saying. So I just think you got to be cautious, but I don't discount them. I think they play an important role in providing information. With that caveat, that depending on who they are, you may want to verify the information before you act on it from a legislative perspective. So that's part of the process that Craig asked about writing the bills too. Before we write it, before we actually drop legislation, I'm going to try to run as many traps as I can too. Because I'd rather run the traps before I drop a piece of legislation than find out I stepped into not just a trap, but maybe a minefield.
Sure.
That's really not a good thing to do. So we will the staff will make a lot of inquiries as to this is what we're thinking. What do you think? How would this impact you? And we'll actually then actively seek other individuals who will have information, even if they haven't come to us. And then if I feel comfortable, and my staff together, we talk, we feel comfortable that this is on pretty sound policy footing, then we will put it forward. But inevitably, even when you do that, people still continue to come out of the woodwork as they see legislation, because then once the legislation hits, it gets publicized more and people will come forward. But we try to minimize folks coming forward that we are not anticipating to come forward.
Sure.
We as you know, dive into a lot of numbers at our center, and we're impressed by your effectiveness as a lawmaker. One pattern that we saw more broadly in the 116th Senate, and I'm wondering if you have some insights on, we just saw a lot more bills sponsored by Democratic senators in the 116th than we did in the 115th. And we didn't know if that was, let's put forward a broad agenda in hopes that we're in the majority in the future, or if there was anything systematic there. You aware of anything along those lines?
No, I'm not. That's an interesting statistic. I'm not aware. We haven't talked about that in the caucus. Like get as many bills as you can out. That didn't happen. Some of it it's hard to explain without getting into it because there was no concerted effort. But part of it too, the more bills you have, it is a cumulative process. You try this year, and those you think are good, you'll introduce again. But then you'll come up with even more ideas the next Congress that'll add on top of what you had before. Yeah. And so the list does start to accumulate a little bit. And if you're in the minority, perhaps you're not passing as many, so your backlog starts growing and growing.
I suppose so. Very nice. Our time is coming close, and we're wanting to be respectful of your time, but we did want to give you one final opportunity. Is there anything further or insights that you're wanting to share with us on your lawmaking career to date?
Well, I just want to thank you. Thanks for both of you. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for thinking very broadly about how we make our legislative branch more effective and getting things done. And I just think the work you're doing is very valuable, and I appreciate the efforts you're putting forward, and look forward to continuing to see your future studies as you dig deeper into these issues. So thank you for what you're doing.
Fantastic. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much. We'll hope to have you at one or both of our campuses at some point in the future.
I look forward to it.
Great.